All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to our webinar on planning for and managing the impacts of changing precipitation patterns on wastewater and stormwater systems. My name is Kristen Crew from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Before we begin, we're going to go over a few logistics and then we can get started. During the webinar today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box anytime throughout the session. We will be saving your questions for a facilitated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording and other information that you may need. You can also download the slides from today in the Handouts tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. This webinar has not been submitted for pre-approval of continuing education credits, but eligible attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for their personal record. To receive a certificate for this session, you must attend for the entire session and register and attend individually using your real name and unique email address. Certificates will be sent via email within 30 days of the webinar date. If you have questions or if you need assistance, please contact smallsystems@syr.edu. Now for a little bit about us. The Environmental Finance Center Network provides training and technical assistance to small water and wastewater systems in all U.S. states and territories through our building technical, managerial, and finance capacity programs. If your community or utility needs assistance with drinking water or wastewater system management, please feel free to contact us through our request form. I will be sharing this shortly in the chat. On that note, we can go ahead and get started. I would like to introduce our first presenter for today from the University of Maryland Environmental Finance Center, Stephanie Dalke. Stephanie, I will go ahead and hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Kristen. And let's see if I can get my screen shared here. Okay, can you all see slides?
Yeah, it looks good stuff.
Okay, fantastic. So thank you everyone for attending today, and we're going to throw a lot of information out here, so we're going to get going. But first, this is what we're going to go through. We're going to have a little bit of background and stage setting, and then we'll move into information on precipitation data updates and future projections. Then we'll get into some planning and decision support tools that are available to help managers figure out what to do with this information. And we'll hear about some cases and examples, and then have some time for questions and answers at the end. So presenting today is myself, Stephanie Dalke. I'm a program manager at the Environmental Finance Center at the University of Maryland. And we also have Ellen Mecray, who is with NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and Art DeGaetano, who is at Cornell and the NOAA Northeast Regional Climate Center, Steve Fries with the Environmental Protection Agency, Creating Resilient Water Utilities Initiative, and Geneva Gray, who's also with the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. So first up, we have a couple of poll questions that we'd like to just hear from you all about where you're from and what sectors you might work in. So if we could get those launched. Okay, and I can't see polls going.
It's open.
Okay.
All right, and get those answers in. I'll be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1.
Yeah, it looks. Oh, go ahead, Kristen.
Yeah, it looks like we have people from all over. Most are coming in from Region 3 and Region 4, about 42%. And following that, we have 22% from Region 1 and 2, but we have, looks like folks from all over
Great.
EPA regions.
Okay, and then we have one other poll question about sector.
Yes, which sector or group does your work represent? Utility operator, federal or state government, local government or tribal nation or entity, academic, nonprofit or private/consulting, or other, and feel free to type that into the chat. All right, and go ahead and get your answer in. I'll be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. All right, Stephanie. So 52% of people are coming in from federal or state government. Following that, there's 22% from academic, nonprofit, private, or consulting. But we have a little bit of everything. I haven't gotten anything in the chat regarding where people are coming from. Okay, I'm seeing a TA provider actually now and a consultant. So it looks like we also have a little bit of everything.
Great. Okay, thank you for that. So that's some helpful context about who's here today. So thanks, everyone. I'm going to move on quickly to set the stage and move into our presenters. Okay, so just real briefly, I wanted to set the stage for what we're talking about today. And so in general, what we're talking about here are changing precipitation patterns, which have been changing over the past century, and particularly in the past 50 or 60 years. They've changed pretty notably in some regions of the United States. And generally, this means that what we're seeing is that heavier rain events have become heavier. And so proportionally, a higher percentage of a region's annual rainfall might be occurring in fewer events. And so this has a lot of implications for folks on the receiving end of all of that water. So there's more water to deal with in shorter amounts of time. There's more runoff because the water can't be absorbed. And then this begins to test the capacity of infrastructure that's in place, whether that's water, wastewater, stormwater infrastructure, and related pieces of infrastructure. And so what we can see is problems even if you're not operating a combined sewer system. So there might be problems with your stormwater capacity, but also this can cause wastewater capacity issues if you've got too much inflow. And potentially there could even be future regulatory concerns if you're kind of having trouble handling all the capacity during these heavy events. Also, this might change your operations and maintenance needs or schedules and might kind of start to affect the lifespans of infrastructure. And so what we want to lay out today is kind of what kind of information is available that can help factor into these decisions and help you manage these issues. So these changing conditions start to raise a lot of questions for utility managers. And so what we cannot answer all these questions for you all today, but we do want to kind of set the stage for what information is out there that can help you start to make decisions differently. And one thing I wanted to highlight here is this quote I found in a recent report by the Water Utility Climate Alliance. It says, "There's no consistent federal guidance or regulatory mandates that require utilities to use forward-looking climate modeling and information in their planning. And as a result, each agency typically uses their own methods to prepare for future risk based on their own analyses and available climate science and their own leadership directives." So there's sort of a disconnect in between how you generally make decisions about infrastructure and how you think about the future. And there's a lot of uncertainty, but the speakers today are going to go through a lot of the new tools that are coming out that will help everyone wade through this process. So next up, we're going to switch over to Ellen Mecray from NOAA. And Ellen, just let me know when to change slides.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thank you guys so much for inviting us. And it's just wonderful to hear that the majority of your folks are in my region. I'm the Regional Climate Services Director for NOAA's Eastern region. which goes from Maine through South Carolina and covers EPA regions 1 through 4. So it's great to see all of you guys on here, and I'll take you through a few things. So thank you. So the disaster trends and why our work matters, that is the biggest deal, right? We have all experienced this kind of heavy precipitation that Stephanie set the stage with. It's not raining the way it used to, and we have that in the data. We're seeing, at least in 2022. I should have put in 2023, except that it's not even complete yet, but we've already seen quite a time in calendar year 2023 in terms of extreme flooding, which is what we'll talk about, but also fires, etc. So the $1 billion events is an interesting tool. If you guys are interested, you can click on that QR code and it'll take you to our $1 billion disasters tool, which includes things like the bar graphs as well as the map displays. You can get it by year, you can get it by quarter, you can get it by specific disaster. So focusing in on the $1 billion disasters that we've seen over the years, we're definitely seeing an increase in these disasters. And that's a combined total of drought, wildfire, flooding, winter storms, and tropical cyclones. Next one, thanks. So I want to talk a little bit in the next couple of slides about what our administrator means by authoritative. Sort of a funny term, and it's something that in the last few years, Dr. Spinrad, who's the director of NOAA, has been saying, you know, NOAA produces authoritative products and services in the space of climate information, climate services, and also in terms of our observed network. And the reason for that is because of this this base pyramid, starting with number 5 at the bottom. What supports all of the work that we do in the service delivery aspect, which, you know, I serve in this orange space, or the sort of tip of the spear, my boss calls it. But the reason why we're in service delivery and being able to offer decision support tools like the $1 billion disaster tool is because it's based in a tremendous amount of investment in observing infrastructure that's at the base of the pyramid. So that whole pyramid is supported by robust observations, including both in situ, or actually measured on the ground, as well as our remote sense stuff that we have in our satellite systems. So between the two, we have a 24/7 data collection across the country and the globe. Additionally, we steward those data. So the data aren't just coming in and we put them right into the archive, but our data are considered archive quality because every data point is visited and examined and said, you know, these data points are, you know, is it a 6 or an 8 is what I always joke about, okay? And our guys will examine that, and they'll question if it's an 8, if every other data point around it is a 6. And so what I mean by that is it's visited, it's examined, and it's considered robust in terms of what ends up in the National Centers for Environmental Information archive, which is all of the observed record. Additionally, our researchers do a lot of research and development and bring our products to life through that development using all of the data that I just talked about. And then we move that into not only observed work, but our predictions and projection work. So when the Weather Service moves into forecasting, they're using the state of the science models, and also in the climate arena, we're using our existing observing infrastructure as well as the science of the global climate models, which our laboratory supports at the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab, which is one of, you know, just a few of the global climate models. So that's what, you know, the combined effort that's done at NOAA in terms of the data that you're going to see. Next slide. So a little bit more on the concept of authoritative is really the notion refers to not only the credible science and the rigor that our scientists do when it comes to their data analysis, but also, like I said, the carefully sourced and transparent information. The data are stewarded, and I say visited, but what I mean is that those data are discoverable. You can find them. You'll know the origin of those data, and you'll know that they're preserved in perpetuity so that you can visit them yourself and download all of the data that we're using. Additionally, and in the arena that I play in, is that we work in the service arena where we communicate with folks like yourselves across lots of different sectors. So I really appreciate Stephanie's question about the, you know, what part of the sector are you in? We work with energy providers, insurance providers, water utilities like yourselves and others. And so all of this is proof that our data are being used, and that creates the value of our information. And so we appreciate you guys using NOAA as one of your primary sources, basically. Next slide. So in the service delivery arena, and this is another thing that I work in primarily, and that is we're out here on the ground in the regional climate services arena, building those relationships with a lot of the different sectors I mentioned. We understand and use your feedback, and so I'm very interested in your feedback to understand how we can improve our products and services. So we need to be able to hear from you guys and translate that into improvements that we can make. We go down in the assess portion of the wheel at the 6 o'clock space, and we decide whether or not that's actually something that NOAA is going to do with our own products, or do we bring it back to folks like Steve, who you'll hear about later, and other agencies that are sometimes more tightly connected to a specific sector. So it may be something that we hear, but we share that with a lot of our federal partners that are also on this call. We then address the need either directly or with our partners and help to deliver that together so that we have an understanding of our value and our impact to your decisions. So that's the whole scope of service delivery in our mind, is to be able to create new products and also improve existing ones. And so I'll talk more specifically about one of the products that we're doing that with, and that is our Atlas 1415 work. So the next slide just shows where each of us are located. So that's me, if you're wondering what, without camera, what we look like. I'm over in the eastern region, just over Maine. And then I have 5 other colleagues around the country that help to interpret and understand NOAA's climate information on the ground for all of you. So if you're located in any of the other regions that you mentioned in the poll, I would encourage you guys to reach out to Joe Casola, for example, in the red shirt in the west, Doug Cluck in the central region, Sharon Misick in the south, John Mara in the Pacific Islands, not just Hawaii, but all the Pacific Islands, and Jesse Cherry across Alaska. So if you want those names or our emails, you can use that QR code on the left. And I just want to say that it's not just the 6 of us out here, but we also work very closely with our regional climate centers. You'll hear from Art DeGaetano on his expertise in evaluating extreme precipitation with some of the products specific to the eastern region. And we also work more locally with our state climatologists. So it's a really great collection that moves from national to regional to local scale. Next slide. So as I mentioned, I want to talk specifically about our Atlas 14 product. Many of you have been working with Atlas 14 and have used that really as an examination of the change in extreme precipitation. We know it doesn't rain like it used to, but how do we use the data to show that that is the case? And how do we use those data in your own work to inform that built infrastructure and to make sure that you're building something that is appropriately sized for the amount of rain that we can expect, not just in total across the season, but as Stephanie mentioned in the National Climate Assessment that was released in 2018. Another one, by the way, is coming in October. So it's very exciting to welcome the National Climate Assessment version 5, which will be out at the end of October. So you can reference that, but we all know that these events are happening in much more extreme ways. We're seeing drought in the summer sometimes, and we're also seeing intense rainfall over a 24-hour period, and that's the work that Atlas 14 undergoes. So you'll see some of these updates are still happening. I was on a crusade, and Art will tell you, the beginning part of my time as the Regional Climate Service Director was spent saying, hey, can you please update Atlas 14 from the 1950s to today? So we did have success in receiving volume 10 for the Northeast back in, I think it was 2012 or so. So that was exciting and much, much needed. And you can see the same is true for volume 13 for the Mid-Atlantic. So these are slow, and I admit it. I work for NOAA, but I certainly understand the plight of the people that I work with on the ground. So it's my job to bring that voice back in and say, please, please hurry up. We're experiencing this now. We can't wait. We're trying to sort out how we do these analyses, either ourselves, as was mentioned in the WUCA quote, or what can we do in the meantime while we're waiting until 2025? And that's really the big question. So what our group, and you can move to the next slide, but what our group has been doing is trying to get that message back in. There is an Atlas 14 and 15 office that is located in the Weather Service, and that URL is at the bottom left. So it's the Hydrometeorological Design Center, and that's the folks that are actually the developers of this product. So I am the voice for them in this particular webinar. But just to mention a few of the things that Atlas 14 features and why it might be worth the wait in some ways. So the product is really examining every single precipitation data piece across the entire country and in each region. Those are gathered from everyone that has a rain gauge, basically. Those data are then examined. We're looking at different recurrence intervals. We're looking at confidence intervals. It has very high spatial resolution, and it also has a regional approach that allows for some of those rare frequency events to be captured, where if you're only using one single source or so, that doesn't really capture the difference in precipitation. We always say that rain is very local and the impacts are very local. So we have to be able to capture that with some of the lesser known rain gauges beyond the airport stations that we have, which we call our ASOS stations. So underlined is really the point about extensive quality control. As I mentioned, that difference between a 6 and an 8. It is intense because of all of the different data points across the region that is under examination. So the other thing, though, is that the Atlas 14 product does not account for a changing climate. So these analyses are done in stationarity, which means that it's only what you see at the moment. It's not projected forward, and it's not blended with any projections. And it's done like the previous map showed in very region-specific ways. So you get, volume 10, volume 11, all the way through volume 13. So there are plans to still do these calculations in order to complete the whole country for Atlas 14. At the same time, there's been a lot of work with Congress to try to improve the support for this program and this product, and to do it much more consistently across the country. So let's go to the next slide. So the Atlas 15, which is not a very imaginative new title, but is nevertheless an examination of accounting for non-stationarity in a scientific manner. How are we going to improve on Atlas 14 to incorporate the changing climate? And how are we going to do this in a robust manner scientifically? And so over the last several years, this program has been working with Penn State University and the University of Illinois and the University of Wisconsin to do an examination, using hydrometeorological studies, using the expertise at these universities to come up with a way to incorporate climate. And they were doing this in an experimental way with volume 10 from the Northeast. So they were developing a very robust methodology that has been reviewed extensively by not only these universities, but also through a group of federal and local scientists and academics across the country. That review was conducted in January and basically has resulted in the creation of a methodology which you can then review online. So that's all been published. It went out for public review, so anyone could comment. So it's considered a highly influential scientific report, which means it's undergone extensive review. Next slide. The other part was, as I mentioned, there was a lot of work done with the Hill. And luckily, with the bipartisan infrastructure law, it did include very specifically that NOAA would be supported to modernize the precipitation frequency and probable maximum precipitation studies. So with large support specific to infrastructure and transportation and power plants, and they should also add water facilities and water treatment plants and water utilities, that NOAA will update and revise the precipitation atlases, not only Atlas 14 to complete that, but produce Atlas 15 across the country, which is, as I mentioned, a really long-standing requirement. So next slide. So the Atlas 15 product has a really long time scale, again, in large part because of the rigor that's needed across the examination of data. Volume 1 will be based on the historical gauges. So this is the idea that they'll have the first ever national scoped precipitation frequency data across the whole country. It will still have enhancements to Atlas 14, but it will still be non-stationary, or it'll still be using mostly the historical observations. And then in volume 2, it will incorporate the climate adjustment factors using some of the methodology that I think Art will talk about, as well as some of the work that's been done by Ken Kunkel and others in products that they did for the Department of Defense. So it will include all those calculations that will improve Atlas 14 into the climate arena and the climate timescale. Next slide. So just go ahead and click on all these really, because I don't need to go into the whole thing, but basically the timeline is a bit long. It's not just a bit long, so I can already feel your frustration because I've had it too. We've had a lot of pushing inside of NOAA to improve on the delivery of Atlas 15 volume 1 and 2 by 2026, and instead been saying, look, we need pilots, we need early data. This group has offered us volume 1 and 2 over Montana as a pilot in 2024. So they're going to zoom in on that particular state. And I don't have an answer on why. But, you know, because I was like, well, hey, how about New England, which is the size of Montana, and you get 6 states for the price of 1. So, you know, we've been pushing, and I think that that's going to continue to happen as we see some of these other products coming out. So, so that's underway, but for now, the development office is very clear on their timelines that CONUS will be done first, or the continental United States for those unfamiliar with the bazillion government acronyms. And OCONUS meaning Hawaii, Alaska, Puerto Rico, and the other US islands will be done by 2026. So that's sort of the gist there, but it takes a really long time, as I said, on the front end of the methodology examination, the public notice on the methodology, and the awarding of contracts as always. Next slide. All right, so I think I'll just let you read the summary because I just looked at my watch and we've got a lot of other folks to get to here that are going to show you some really great enhancements to existing products that I think will address this audience very specifically. So I just want to say thank you, and I appreciate your patience, and I think that the rigor of this product may be worth your weight, especially given the amount of investment that's done in the infrastructure arena. It is, you know, NOAA certainly is the authoritative source of these data, and when used in their entirety. So it's not just using NOAA data and cherry picking certain stations, but it is using the entirety of the observed record, and that's what develops the rigor. So that's where I'll stop. I think the next slide is really just my finishing slide.
Okay, thank you so much, Ellen. I'm trying to get my mouse over here. All right. So yeah, and folks, if you download the PDF of the slides, you'll be able to get some of these links and such available to look into for more information. And so now I'm going to pass over the controls to Art. Art, I'm handing you over the controls, so you should be able to control your slides.
Despite what we did before, I do not yet have control of my slides.
Uh-oh. Okay, try again.
Still nothing.
Okay. Okay, try one last time, and if not, we'll just plow through.
Looks like we're plowing through.
Okay, sorry about that.
It worked like a charm before.
Yeah, I don't know what we did differently. Okay, well,
All right.
go ahead.
Oh, I just thought let me try one
there
other
you go.
thing.
I see your mouse.
There
Great.
we go. All right, maybe we're just slow. So thanks a lot for passing the baton, Stephanie. Just to start off with, this is a lot of work by a lot of people other than myself, so I am kind of the voice again today. And as you'll see, one of the things that kind of Ellen alluded to earlier, is the climate centers basically work very, very closely with stakeholders. So a lot of the credits over there are really the stakeholders we have worked with, and in a large part who have funded a lot of the work that we're going to talk about. And then also, I think Ellen's slide said something about 2026 when Atlas 14 has been out. Again, a lot of our stakeholders have really been eager to see projections of extreme rainfall in their regions. So I would say we've kind of maybe gotten a leg up early on Atlas 15. And you'll see that some of these are being used in some of the states, particularly in the mid-Atlantic. So don't have to say that rainstorms are growing more severe in risk. You've heard that from the last two speakers. If you even look at this year, I think in a previous slide, I kind of came up with a list of events, and I think it topped 7 or 8 already this year. What I'd like to do is kind of set the stage for how do we determine what these extreme rainfall values are, particularly for design criteria. And the analogy I like to use is it's kind of like trying to guess all the poker hands without sort of playing with a full deck, if you pardon the pun there. And why you don't have a full deck is because we have a limited climatology of rainfall, 50 years, maybe at best 100 years. And from that, we're trying to estimate the probability of things like a 100-year or a 500-year storm. The way we work on our estimates, and actually, again, it follows closely what NOAA has done in Atlas 14 and will do in Atlas 15. We start off with what's called a partial duration series. And basically, it's the N biggest rainfall events in N years of data. So my example here at Boston has a 72-year record. So from the Boston record, we've extracted the largest 72, in this case, daily rainfall amounts. We could do the same thing with any duration, multiple days, an hour, even a minute if we have precipitation at that resolution, that duration resolution. From there, it basically is an exercise in statistics. So on the left side of your screen is kind of this partial duration series, the N biggest rainfall amounts presented as a histogram. And then through the magic of statistics, we fit a distribution to that. Generally, the generalized extreme value distribution is used, and that's done for two reasons: to kind of smooth out the sampling variations. There's no reason this bar happens to be a little bit lower than that bar, so that kind of smooths out those probabilities as we kind of tail off. And then also fitting the distribution allows us to extend the record beyond what the station showed. So if we only have a 72-year record at Boston, we can estimate what the 100-year or the 500-year storm is based on this theoretical distribution. We then, from that distribution, that also allows you to do resampling to kind of say, hey, again, if you think of the poker analogy, if you don't know what all the decks of cards are, you have a little bit of uncertainty, and that's what this resampling analysis does. So in the end, when we get a 100-year storm, it's not one value, it's not that one shuffle of the deck or deal of the deck, but actually it allows us to see the entire distribution. So in a lot of ways, it's kind of frustrating to me where in engineering design, there's one number used for the 100-year storm, where actually there's a distribution, there's a confidence interval where really in anywhere within that confidence interval is a likely outcome of what the extreme rainfall would be. So that's kind of the really quick Reader's Digest version of kind of our methodology. And then the idea becomes, if we just had to figure out what the, in this case, 2020 100-year storm is based on the observed record, that's not too bad. But basically, people are asking us, is that adequate to use for planning in the future? So does what we get from data through 2020 or 2022 or 2023 apply to the future? And if not, how does it have to be changed? Has been really the focus of our work over the last several years. So basically to do that, we rely on climate model projections. And really, I could probably give a whole talk on projections, but basically the things that need to go into this is really an emission scenario, whether we're going to continue to emit greenhouse gases at our current rate or start to mitigate our emissions. So I'll kind of present that as high or low. We then have to feed those emissions through any number of global climate models. So these are models that work across the entire globe at fairly coarse resolution. So kind of think of a degree of latitude by a degree of longitude. So if you're up here in, I guess it's what, EPA regions 1 and 2 in the Northeast, there's probably about, 5 to 10 grid boxes that cover that region on the global scale. That really doesn't give you the right spatial resolution to do any type of planning in terms of water resources and extreme rainfall. So those data need to be downscaled, and that can be done statistically and dynamically. Statistically, again, using statistical routines, dynamically using a more complex, higher resolution model. Those go through our statistics. So there's my impact model. And then finally, you get to the projections. And the thing to keep in mind in each of these steps, from emissions to global model to downscaling to our statistical model in the end, really the uncertainty in the process increases. So again, a complicated slide. 2 things to point out: the red box, just like Atlas 14, just like Atlas 15 will do in the future. Everything is based on a change factor, or what we call a change factor. And what this really is ARI is annual recurrence interval. So think of 100-year storm. And basically what that would say is it basically is a ratio of what the climate model projections are saying the 100-year storm is in the future to what the 100-year storm is in the historical period. And that's the model's historical period that allows us to kind of minimize any biases in the model. So it's a change factor. So in this case, our current stakeholders use these change factors by going to Atlas 14, looking at the value that Atlas 14 says for their particular region, and then multiplying that by the change factor. So these change factors are typically greater than 1, and they inflate the Atlas 14 values to be representative of future conditions. And there is a lot of number crunching going on here. So basically in our methodology, there are 31 global models that are downscaled statistically, and each of those has basically a number of resampled statistical uncertainty analyses. We've done 1,000 of them. So that's 31,000 values from the statistically downscaled LOCA data set, and then another 16,000 values from a dynamically downscaled Cortex data set. So if you do the math real quick, we have 47,000 different values which we can kind of look at that distribution from. So if I'm saying something like this is my confidence interval, maybe my 90% confidence interval, there are a lot of values that are going in there to kind of help smooth out a lot of the uncertainty in that case. So kind of focusing in on New Jersey, some work we did for the state of New Jersey. What do these change factors look like? So right now I'm looking at a high emission scenario, and I am also looking for the end of the century. And my colors basically tell me what the adjustment is for either the 2-year storm, the 25-year storm, or the 100-year storm. So if you kind of focus on that slate blue area, that's an increase of about 15 to 20%. Particularly for the 2-year storm. So we get out to the 100-year storm, in a lot of cases up here in the New York City watershed and up into New York and Pennsylvania, those adjustments are as much as 30%. So 30% higher than the current Atlas 14 values. We can look at the range of values. So for my 2-year storm, the median is what I showed you in the last slide. And if we go to kind of a lower end, the 17th percentile, you can see over the region still increases, but more like 10%. And if we look at the higher end of that confidence bound, a lot of dark blue there, that gets up to that 30% range. For the 2-year storm, a storm that we would expect to occur once every other year. If I look at the 100-year storm, again, the uncertainty really grows. So here's that middle of the road median scenario that I talked about. But if we look at the low end of the confidence bound, we can see a lot of places across New Jersey and even in the New York City metropolitan area where the adjustments are actually less than 1 in this case. But then if we look at the higher end of the uncertainty bound, I had to change my color scale. These reds are on the order of 50 to even 60%. So again, a lot of uncertainty when we get out to that big 100-year storm. If we look at the medians for the lower emissions, that makes a sort of big difference. Our median adjustments across New Jersey in high emissions, again, 15 to 20%. But if we look at lower emissions, they're more like 7.5%. So final products. It's like, how do we take all this statistics and data and make it useful to our stakeholders? So here's a number of products that we've put out, basically websites, depending on who is interested in our work. So the work here to the left is for the Delaware River Basin Commission. That's the outline of the basin there. In the upper right is probably our first work with the MRISA, one of NOAA's CAP-RISA teams, where we looked at the Chesapeake Bay watershed in the yellow outline, and then also piggybacked for the entire state of Virginia. And then more recently, some work we did for the state of New Jersey. And each of these websites have their own kind of flavor to them. I'm going to focus in on the MRISA site, since that's basically shows the functionality of most of them. They're all based on change factors. They're typically based on a county level, and they require a bunch of user input. What storm do you want? What emission scenario? What time period, basically. So we can click through that, and we can maybe select the 100-year storm and maybe a high emission scenario, and maybe the end of the century. If you notice, my graph changes each time I do that. So with the 100-year storm, end of the century, high emissions, a lot of blue up here through Pennsylvania. Again, change factors of about 30%, kind of going along with what we saw in New Jersey. If you maybe get down into Virginia here, some lower change factors, but still in all cases greater than 1. That's about 15 to 20%. The site is all kind of based on tooltips. So my mouse, when I took this screenshot, was over Grayson County. I think that's in Virginia. And you can see the median change factors in the range of change factors for that county. The little white dots on the map are stations that have long-term records. So each of those dots is clickable. So if I go here to a site in Washington, D.C., the National Arboretum, it basically shows the change factors for that site. Notice they're based on Prince George County values because we chose not to downscale to a spatial scale smaller than a county. That was, again, something that was desired by our stakeholders. If you continue to click, I've clicked on the dot again, and I'm now able to see a chart. So this is kind of a classic intensity, duration, frequency curve. These are different durations of rainfall from 3 hours to 6 hours out to 24 hours. This is the amount of rainfall. And then what is shown here is the red line is the Atlas 14 value. The blue line is what we've computed for the future, and in this case, a high emissions scenario for the end of the century. So you can see the values are substantially higher. At this 12-hour duration, Atlas 14 says 6.88 inches as the 100-year storm, whereas the projections are about 8.2 inches. And then also shown here are the confidence intervals. So the thing to note here is in the very broad 90% confidence interval, the light blue, Atlas 14 actually falls at the very lower end of it. So the Atlas 14 value is within the realm of what we see in the future, but very low. The chances of that actually occurring are very, very low. We can also toggle on and off the confidence intervals. So there's the Atlas 14 confidence interval in pink. That's an 80% confidence interval. And our projection is in blue. So basically, the projection for the future falls outside of the confidence interval that Atlas 14 gave. So again, giving additional credence to the fact that these values should be updated to take into account the change in climate. There's also tables that are to kind of see the values in a different way. So we see the county change factors for the different percentiles of the distribution, what the actual depth is in the projected series, so at the end of the century, and then as a comparison, what we see for Atlas 14. So in this case, a median value for 1 hour rainfall, 60-minute rainfall, is something like 3.7 inches in the projection, and it was only 3.3 inches in the Atlas 14 data. Can look at it a number of different ways in the comparison table. So maybe a straight comparison and looking at the change. So again, here's that difference that I showed before. It goes up by about 0.6 inches. You can, what do I want to show? You can change stations. So kind of a bad example there, but I went from the National Arboretum to Washington National Airport, keeping in that region. The point that I wanted to make here is you can save these stations. So if you're working at a particular spot, you can kind of bookmark those, so to speak, and come back and look at that data the next time you come around. Any of the graphs, go backwards, I think. Where do I want to go? Really going back. Oh, that little hamburger symbol up here, any of the graphs or data are downloadable, so you can get the chart as a ping or the data that underlies it as a CSV file if you want to use it in your own analyses. And with
Art?
Yes.
We just got another minute or two before we got to switch over to the EPA folks.
There's my last slide. So there's our work for New Jersey. And just to show that New Jersey wanted to do this on a municipality basis. So it was possible to take that downscaled data and downscale it even further. And we can move on.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Art. I'm going to take back control, hopefully, and then move on into the slides for Steve and Geneva, if I can get my mouse back. Here we go. Whoops. Okay. Steve and Geneva.
All right. Am I coming through okay?
Yep.
All right, great. Thanks. And I'm really glad to have our colleagues from NOAA precede us in the presentation, because what we want to bring is illustration of federal effort that's actually applying much of the hard work that goes into developing robust precipitation data for the use in adaptation planning in our case, but just infrastructure design and operational adjustments within water utilities more specifically. Next slide would be great. So we are the Creating Resilient Water Utilities initiative. We're a part of the EPA's Office of Water that has been providing tools, training, and technical assistance for almost 15 years now. We were derived from the Water Security Division originally as part of EPA's response to the events of 9/11 and ensuring the water infrastructure of this country was secure from all threats. We took that within a handful of years after the establishment of the division to include hazards that include natural disasters as well as the effects of climate change. And so today I want to give you a review of what we provide in terms of that assistance and training, then the tools and resources we have online, all of which are publicly available and free for use by communities and those that are providing them with assistance as well. And then I want to share a handful of stories from recent partners, and I've created a subset of our recent technical assistance work that's focused on smaller communities. Well, it's communities of all sizes, but not our largest. But in particular, looking at systems that are challenged with stormwater impacts to their wastewater and stormwater operations. So next slide, please. As I kind of mentioned already, our mission is to provide the service to the water sector, and that includes stormwater and wastewater systems as well, not just drinking water. And we're focused primarily on the risks derived from climate change, and that means mainly adaptation as the effective strategies to try to reduce those risks, to lower the consequences, and better prepare the systems to continue providing their services. One of the biggest challenges we have, and this is true, across the board in terms of things that have complex scientific information or data behind them, is promoting a clear understanding of that information and how it connects to the potential long-term adaptation options. We are working with a sector that's used to uncertainty. They have challenges in terms of how many customers they have. They have challenges in short-term climate already in terms of water availability that they work with. They also have financial interdependencies, as well as the needs of the water, or the energy and the agricultural sector in their areas. So they can think about uncertain things. And they also can build projects that last for multiple decades and multiple generations in some cases. But putting those two together and then applying it to another dimension in terms of climate change has been difficult. And it's required us to collaborate with our partners rather than provide, kind of flat support. Here's a recipe, go use it. Here are all the ingredients from all the federal agencies. Please apply them and mix accordingly. That partnership, that collaboration is really important. And I always think back to an anecdote that was provided by one of our early team members, which is working with, I think it was systems in New England. We were talking about culvert sizing and precipitation, coincidentally enough. And we shared with them that, projections tell you it's going to be 25% bigger, and they hummed and hawed about it until they basically let us know that culvert sizing in their area really wasn't about how much precipitation was going to happen. It was what's the largest livestock being taken care of in the floodplain, because that's the size of the culvert that's necessary to ensure that flood mitigation or flood damage can be limited in the area. They didn't see a 25% change in precipitation as being a meaningful quantitative value, but it was meaningful qualitatively because it did change how often they were going to have to deal with those impacts. So the sizing wasn't as important as much as their operational treatment of their transportation network and the culverts and other maintenance activities, as well as where they were going to place them. So that was something that we definitely need to take into consideration. There is no one size fits all, no single strategy solution for these partners. Next slide, please. So this is basically a survey of what we offer in terms of our direct partnership and activities with the sector. And I'm not going to go through all of this in detail. I'm very glad the slides will be shared with everyone afterwards. But I did want to highlight that we've had a very busy year, our fiscal year 23, which is just about to end at the end of this month. We've actually reached over 70 communities. The slide's a little out of date. And we have plans to reach over 50 next year. We are actually developing those now. And of those communities, over a third are under 10,000 people in terms of the customers served. And I would say that the stormwater wastewater contingent is about 50-50 to drinking water as well in those numbers. So a much bigger focus on smaller communities, much larger focus in terms of who we're working with, in terms of making sure that when we advise them on adaptation strategies and try to help build their capacity related to adaptation, that we're considering EJ or environmental justice and other types of considerations within their service area, and also a much greater coordination with funding agencies, both within the federal government as well as in state agencies and NGOs. We also do traditional training. Much of this is on our website. The link is here. And forgive me, just for the interest of time, I'm just going to go ahead and give this entire presentation, but my colleague Geneva Gray is online. She has a very technical climate change, hydrologic modeling or hydraulic modeling kind of background. So I'm sure she was very interested in the goings on at NOAA and has been a very valuable resource for us in communicating that information to our partners. Next slide, please. So we have two different tools, the Resilience Strategies Guide and Create, and I'm going to highlight both of those briefly on one slide each, I believe, coming up. But the Resilience Strategies Guide is meant to be a tool to introduce water utilities in the communities that rely on them to the interconnectedness between what they have in terms of assets, the types of things that are changing due to climate change in terms of threats or challenges, and what they can do about it in terms of strategies to adapt. We've used sector experience to develop this kind of connected logic within the tool to allow utilities to go in, put in very generic information about what they're worried about, and find out what others in the water sector that are similar to them, either geographically or in terms of size or in terms of the services they provide, what they're already doing about it, and then also connect them to some of the funding resources that are available that might be able to support the projects that they should consider in terms of adapting to their concerns related to climate change. They can also take the outputs from this guide and feed it into CREATE, which is our risk assessment tool. It's a framework that helps organize all of that information, provides opportunities to be more detailed, in particular about economic factors like cost of strategies as well as potential losses, and actually challenge these plans to see which ones might provide positive returns on their investment. To support all of this, we've developed a lot of data services and maps, a majority of which are all derived from and linked to other federal government resources, but translated and limited in their terms of their scope and vision to make sure that they can support the types of questions we know water utilities are asking as they're going through a risk assessment process. So this focuses on many of the large scale and challenging threats and changes that we're seeing in climate, including stream flow changes, both high flow and low flow changes, snowpack, wildfire, overall storms and heat waves, as well as coastal effects, in particular related to storm surge inundation and hurricanes. Next slide, please. As I just characterized quickly before, the Resilience Strategies Guide does walk folks through a process of challenging what they're worried about and thinking and seeing what other strategies and solutions have already been offered up by the sector. We've also provided a report that they can use to document and communicate. And we've actually had water utilities and communities use the data available within the guide to develop surveys within their organization to actually get a temperature, and pardon the metaphor, for what their staff and what their community is worried about in terms of climate challenges, or maybe what their appetite or tolerance is for certain adaptation strategies. It's been very great in terms of seeing how this introductory resource has been applied and used by both TA providers as well as community leaders and water utility staff. Next slide. CREATE, as I said before, is built on very much the same data pillars as the Resilience Strategies Guide, but offers a depth and an ability to compute and aggregate your results into a meaningful risk assessment result. While the decisions that you're going to be informing using CREATE are relatively high level or screening level decisions, it is not a budgetary or long-term investment type of tool. Those are other types of activities. It also doesn't have a climate simulation engine of any kind, but it pulls and organizes information about climate change through information about the potential losses and assets that are managed and protected by the system, the types of planning that you can do, the options you have for lowering those losses, and then compiles it all through a series of guided decisions in the risk assessment module to ensure that you get a result that shows you, if you do something, what benefits could you realize, and how do those compare to the option of doing nothing. And we've had some of our partners actually reveal a meaningful result where adaptation would be premature. They don't know enough about what the potential losses are or the potential climate scenarios, or the climate scenarios do not cross a meaningful threshold for them yet. And they know that they need to revisit this process in the future. This isn't neither outcome is a declarative to act or not to act, but it does provide them with a tool that they can continue to iterate and continue to revisit the process to learn more as they go through time. Next slide. And this is just a visual example of the types of results we generate when we conduct technical assistance. On the left side is an example of the output graphs that can come out of the tool. Any user that uses the tool generates similar outputs that for their consideration, where green is your benefit, and then gray, the last bar, is the cost in this example. Again, trying to compare what you can gain by adapting versus what you need to invest to do so. On the right-hand side is our map of case studies. It says 75 to date. Again, this is over a decade of experience working with the sector. And then examples of the reports that we generate. And we also provide a short version of the report online. So for many of the 75 that are on our case study map, the link of to which is on a previous slide, have these 1 to 2 page briefs that describe our experience working with them, and have a point of contact at the utility or at town hall or the community we worked with that can provide more information if you're interested in connecting with them. EPA doesn't want to be a broker for connecting between water utilities to each other. We want to be providing a network for this community that's building. Next slide, and forgive me, I know we're at the hour. Stephanie and organizers, is it okay for me to keep going?
I think so, but I don't know, Kristen, if we've got a hard stop.
No, absolutely. Keep going. Folks, I understand if you need to hop off since it is at the end of the hour, but yes, we can go ahead and keep going.
I promise 5 great case studies for those of you that can stick with me for another few minutes.
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
So all of these case studies they're from across the country. They vary in size and challenge, and they all have interesting outcomes from working with us at CREW and EPA. And hopefully they could emulate potential technical assistance opportunities that some in the audience might be seeking for themselves, or maybe seeking to provide to others or communities that are out there. The first example, and it's one of our older ones, is working with South Monmouth, the Regional Sewage Authority, coastal New Jersey. I know New Jersey was central to some of the graphs that Art was showing earlier. It's 8 communities totaling 50,000 folks, so 8 smaller communities in New Jersey, all of whom have a history of coastal flooding, not just Sandy, but storm surge that imperils their systems. Remember, they're trying to get their treated wastewater out of their systems, so they're low elevations along the beach. They actually developed, before even working with us, a very innovative trailer-based approach to moving the parts of their pump stations that could not be inundated in floods. So they could actually literally hitch them up to a trailer and drive them to higher ground before the storm, and then bring them back and hook them back up. And but they also wanted to know, for some of their locations where they were doing this very frequently, they were having some limitations in terms of staffing, and in some cases missed opportunities to move, whether harder solutions or other types of measures could actually provide them with increased resilience, so the number of events where they had to move things would be reduced. But in either case, working with us, they realized that they didn't realize how far in advance of others they were until working with us. And they actually partnered with us to host training for other coastal systems in New Jersey and that part of the Mid-Atlantic, so that others could learn not only from them, but from each other, as well as be exposed to what we had to offer to help everyone prepare better for coastal storms and limit the amount of service interruptions experienced. Next slide. Another example that we've worked with is in Massachusetts. It's the Montague and South Hadley. Sorry, I'll get a little ahead, but I don't know all the data. Montague and South Hadley, they're 2 communities along the Connecticut River in Western Mass, 2,000 and 17,000 residents respectively. They were looking at changing storms and collection issues, and they just wanted to basically find ways to change the time of arrival as best they could, as well as some of the infiltration that they were getting into their system. What was interesting about the work with them is they were very open to having folks from not only their Department of Environmental Protection, but also the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, work with them and attend many of the same sessions we were doing. So we're talking about a risk assessment where they're looking at their vulnerabilities. They wanted them in the room for those discussions to build those relationships, as well as get some sense as to what would be acceptable approaches from a regulatory as well as planning point of view, and ensure that when they approached watershed organizations as well as their customers and the residents with these plans, that they had some buy-in from partners. So that was a very rewarding experience for us to see a utility be so open, and we actually have had several follow suit in the last few years. Next slide, please. Crisfield's an example where I've actually worked with many of the folks that are on the line from NOAA, as well as Nature Conservancy and the Maryland EFC, in terms of the support that this community's needed. It's a 2,400 people living along the Eastern Shore. We focused on a subset of their ditch and sewer system. Crisfield is personal importance to me. It's actually, as a high school student, I visited there. It's where I actually learned about climate change phenomenon and witnessed many of the changes and how it was affecting people, and not just a concept from a textbook. And we looked at this assessment in particular just to basically try to complement all the other activity that's going on with federal resources for this community, deservedly so. They're getting the support they need. We wanted to make sure that they had this experience with risk assessment, so that when they started making these larger decisions in collaboration and utilizing all the data being provided and the monies being provided by these other agencies, that they had that perspective, that they knew that they had to assess these carefully and not just pursue, you know, opportunities because they were actions, but actually start to appreciate the value that these had to their community at large, as well as specifically to their performance of their system as well. The next slide. Traverse City is in the Midwest. It's in Michigan, and they have 50,000 customers in 5 townships around the city, very dependent on tourist income to manage their public works. And they actually had a project on their riverfront where they had a lot of overflows they were trying to manage. They were in line to receive SRF funds and looked at that plan critically with our help, related to other types of climate scenarios that they could perturb the flows in their system as long as in the riverfront in combination, and made changes to their project based on what they learned working with us that kept them within the SRF funding limits, but improved the climate resilience of what their resultant project would be versus not looking at it with that perspective. So very different type of timeline as well as action related to many of our other assessments, but a really good example of how projects that are even within the funding pipeline could actually benefit from looking at climate change risk assessment with new information when they have the opportunity. And I think my next example is my last one. It's Clackamas County in Oregon, near Portland. Water and Environmental Services. It's a very big system geographically, but also a couple of the communities are quite densely populated, being a Portland suburb, so 190,000 people. They have a station, which is pictured there, that's in the channel migration zone of the Sandy River. So the river there, depending on flood state, sometimes moves, and sometimes it moves right through the pump station. They were trying to figure out whether they wanted to continue to use temporary barriers or sacrificial assets, things that just die when they get flooded and then replaced with temporary backup power like you see in the picture, or other types of mobile assets, or if they should move the entire system or take advantage of current changes in their transmission and collection to take advantage of a new treatment plant that was already under construction. So a complicated network kind of analysis, not point-based like we usually do, but it was really intriguing, and it was definitely flood-driven type of analysis by, you know, a modestly sized system serving a large number of people. So the last slide I have here is just an acknowledgement that not only have we done the things that I've covered, but we're continuing to do our work. And it really requires connecting with systems and the partners and to funding opportunities. So on the side here are pictures from many of the systems we've worked with over the last 3 years. We're going to continue to support this climate adaptation, and I look forward to anyone that wants to reach out to Geneva or myself or to crew generally. We would love to hear from you and talk about opportunities for providing assistance. So thanks everyone for your time.
Okay, thank you so much, Steve and Geneva on the sidelines. So yes, thank you everyone who stuck with us past the time. I know we had a lot of information and we couldn't quite fit it all in the end, but thank you everyone. And thank you to all of our presenters. It was some great information, and even if it's not clear yet, hopefully you'll be able to follow up with this information and with these people to get assistance in the future as you forge ahead into making decisions about infrastructure, especially sizing questions. So in the slide deck, just to wrap up, there are a few links to some resources that I thought were helpful. And there are plenty more if you follow through with the links from our presenters from NOAA and the Northeast Regional Center and from EPA. So I encourage you to follow up on those and to also take advantage of EPA's assistance through their crew program. It's really helpful for the communities we've seen go through the process. And I think that's about all we have. So we'll probably wrap up here. If I can get to my last slide. Okay, and again, if you've got any other questions, feel free to reach out to us at the Environmental Finance Center, and we're happy to connect you to the other environmental finance centers spread around the country. And I don't know, Kristen, if we've got any other wrap-ups.
Nope, that is going to be it. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to all of the presenters for sharing your expertise with us today. Like Stephanie said, feel free to reach out to us at smallsystems@syr.edu if you have any questions, or you can reach out directly to Stephanie. After this webinar, you'll have a pop-up that will ask you to complete an evaluation. If you could please complete that, we'd really appreciate that. That helps us plan future webinars that are on topics that are important to you. Thank you again, everyone, and we hope to see each of you at a future EFCN event.